Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's session. My name is Sara Bazubandi. I'm a Marie Curie Fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. Tonight, we have three distinguished speakers who are going to unpack the recent presidential election in Iran and the possible consequences and implications that this election could have. The key moment of this presidential election in Iran was not the day of the voting or the day that the results were announced. It already happened when on 25th of May, the Guardian Council announced a decision on the vetting of the candidates because contrary to some speculations, nearly all the reformists and moderate candidates were banned from the race. And this raised concerns over the democratic nature of this election. Ebrahim Raisi was announced as the next president of the Islamic Republic. His victory in this election after an unsuccessful first bid to be elected president in 2007, in which he lost to Rouhani, is of particular significance as it is tied with many questions and uncertainties about the future of Iran. President-to-be, who previously served as the head of Iran's wealthiest religious foundation and a jurist, has deep links to the security apparatus and a track record of involvement in repressing political movements, and most notoriously in the 1988 mass execution of political prisoners in Iran. The election participation rate of about 49%, that is almost 20% less than the previous round, was a strong indicator of the widening rift between the states and the citizens. This was indeed caused by a whole host of factors, including but not limited to economic hardships and general decline of trust in the regime amongst the people. His current position as the elected president of Iran has also prompted the speculations over grooming of Raisi as Iran's next supreme leader. So to unpack this, the potential impact of Raisi's presidency at the domestic, regional, and global level, we have three speakers today. I'm going to introduce them as we go on through their presentations. So I will go ahead and introduce the first speaker. And each speaker will have their remarks on all these three aspects that I mentioned at the domestic, regional, and global level in order to capture a holistic picture of what is to be expected from Raisi's presidency. Our first speaker is Dr. Azadeh Zamiri-Rad. She is the deputy head of the Africa and Middle East Division at the German Institute for International Security Affairs. She has conducted extensive research and policy advisory projects on various aspects of Iranian politics and broader Middle East North Africa region. She was previously the editor of International Affairs Journal, Welt Trends, and a lecturer at Potsdam University. Azadeh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sara, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Since time is very limited, let me just kick things off with a couple of observations on the general elections. Let me start by saying that I think the current situation and the current political trajectory is much more dynamic and much more uncertain than it would appear. As you said, Sara, it seems like Raisi, the elected, basically the winner of these elections, is now in the best position to become the next supreme leader. But I think this is not a given. And in fact, things might turn out a little bit difficult for him as there are a number of challenges to overcome. For one, if you look at the conservatives and hardliners, this is not a united kind of faction. This is not a united camp or a united front. There are still other competitors around. There are other groups, families, and camps who still compete for power. There are also still other names circulating as potential successors, including the name of Khamenei's own son, Mojtaba Khamenei. This is one part of it. But the other part is also that the presidency itself is a quite challenging position. In fact, you could argue that it is the most difficult position to be in the entire political order. Traditionally, it has not really been beneficial for a political career to assume that post. And in fact, since 1989, not a single president has actually gotten out of the presidency unharmed. They were usually marginalized or ostracized. Now, this is something that could happen to Raisi as well. And add to that, that he doesn't really have much experience in actual day-to-day politics. His background is basically 4 decades of different kind of posts that he assumed in the judicial system. So it will, we have to wait and see how well he can actually navigate this very difficult political sphere where the president is basically an open target and exposed to broad criticism. So I think a lot will depend on how long he would actually have to perform on this position before the actual succession question arises. So just to put some limits on this, linear trajectory that Raisi is going to be the next supreme leader, I think there are some challenges to overcome. On the other side, if we look at the electorate, I think we see a couple of very interesting changes here. Obviously, we had the historically lowest turnout in presidential elections in Iran. And I do not think that the tipping point here was the pre-selection by the Guardian Council. In fact, we saw clear indication that even before that, a lot of people were not intending to actually take part in these kind of elections. And this is basically the outcome of more than 4 decades of general unresponsiveness of the Islamic Republic, of the state to popular demands here. So it doesn't really come as an entire, surprise here. But I think it is also important to mention that while we see a lot of apathy, we see a lot of anger, we see a lot of frustration, within those non-voters, we also see a lot of passion, we see a lot of determination, a lot of decisiveness to move forward. So we have to be careful not to mistake the kind of lower turnout for a lower drive towards social change. I think what is changing is that a majority of those voters no longer see voting as an adequate channel to achieve the desired change, at least not through traditional means of reformism. Which brings me shortly to the Reformist Camp, which is obviously one of the biggest losers here. I think we have seen at this point that the Reformists have been rejected by both the state and the populace, at least at this point in time. I think there's no way around it. They need to go through a renewal process. There's been talk about reforming reformists for years now. I think this is the time where you cannot no longer actually put this on hold. So overall, I don't see just apathy and anger. I see a lot of drive still in the population. I think for some of them, the result was actually seen as a big success, as a deliberate act of resistance, as a clear statement of one of the few channels that they have to send a clear message to the state. And in that regard, it was actually quite successful because we are all talking about the low turnout, even in different circles of the Islamic Republic itself. This, of course, does not represent the entirety of those who did not vote, but I think a large portion of those who did not vote are looking for a new kind of avenue of political participation. So to sum up, I think the situation is way more dynamic. We don't necessarily, we won't necessarily see a very, calm time where Raisi can easily prepare his transition. The rift between society and state is likely to grow, and we're likely to see more tension and more fighting rather than less.
Thank you, Azadeh. Thank you very much for drawing a very realistic picture of the situation on the ground. And as you mentioned, the presidential position has been a very difficult position in the sense that almost all the previous presidents have turned into an opposition themselves. As soon as they left office, former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was one of those very outspoken advocates for boycotting this election in response to his rejection by the council. We quickly move on to the next speaker. Dr. Rusba Parsi is our second speaker. Welcome, Rusba. Rusba is the program head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. He was senior research fellow at the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris, focusing on the Middle East and Iran, Middle East in general, and Iran and Gulf states in particular. Prior to that, he was a senior lecturer at Lund University in Sweden. Rusba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I agree a lot with what Azadeh said. I think it's important to be careful with how we extrapolate from any given situation in Iran, exactly because it is much more fluid and dynamic than many people give it credit for. Now, dynamic and fluid doesn't necessarily have to be positive, but it means that it is not in any case something that is predictable because it is already set. Now, I would try and add some things to what Azadeh said. I mean, first of all, yes, we're talking about a transition. We've been talking about this transition for many years, actually. So, I mean, at some point we have to wonder how we are defining this transition. But I think what is important in any case is that for the moment, it seems that those parts of the system that are really trying to call the shots and trying to be the only ones who call the shot, their idea of a transition involves not even the whole political elite and even less of the population. So, I mean, in that sense, the question is whether their understanding of a transition is something that is much more narrow, much more focused, which gives the impression of being very strong, but I think actually in the long run is going to be brittle. I think their grip on that power is going to be much more brittle than they are willing to understand themselves. The other thing, which is even more structural and long-term, is of course the fact that this is an age-old discussion in Iran that goes back to the constitutional revolution of 1905, 1906. That is, where is the source of legitimacy? And I think some of the people that we are seeing now advocating removing the presidency as an institution, what's the whole point of having elections? To some degree, they hark back to an old argument about the people not being the source of legitimacy. And I think that is, if I were to identify one very, very dangerous trend and very tragic trend, that would be it. Because I think that can only lead to greater fissures, and those fissures will at some point be settled with violence, probably. So that is, in my opinion, something that is quite dangerous. There is another kind of continuity that I think is important to point out, and that is the tragedy of all revolutions, which is that they are very bad at solving the problems that led to them and which they claim that they could solve. And in the case of Iran, obviously, the two ones that I think are most important is wealth distribution, that is the lack of it, and corruption. And the fact that this republic has not managed to do enough, not nearly enough on those issues, means that there is a tension and a dynamic within the political elite, no matter which colors they paint themselves in. So like any magnet that points to north and has a south pole, no matter how much you divide this magnet, it's going to have a north pole and a south pole. That is, this system is going to be stuck with this problem until they find some kind of proper solution. It doesn't matter whether there's principalists, not principalists, postmodernists, reformists, they can call themselves whatever they want. This issue is going to be something that's going to be their permanent headache until they solve it. And I think that is something that they all fail at, whether they're reformists or principalists. So far, I have not seen anything that looks like a convincing economic program. And that remains a very important weakness. And the point here, and this is segue to the next thing here, is that this weakness is something that can be exploited both from left and right. I mean, if you look at Mahmoud Ahmadinejad that you mentioned, his populism has a streak of realism, if you will. It has a streak of realism in the sense that he identifies that there are lots of people who might not be directly, totally disaffected with the system, but want that redistribution, whether it's within a new system or this system, but they need it and they want it. And you can tap into that discontent, and you can do it from the right as much as you could from the left, so to speak. And that's, in a sense, why he became a very difficult president to deal with for Khamenei at some point, because the ideas that he had, even though they came supposedly from the right, were quite revolutionary in and of themselves, much more than just trying to retain the system the way it is. And that segment of the electorate is partly, at least, still loyal to the system. They're just not loyal to the people who man the system. And so that's another aspect of how the dynamics of this can move on. As Azadeh already mentioned, and this will be my final point, reformism is in the kind of closed Iranian system a necessity. You can go back to European political systems of the 19th century and see that the idea of reform as a way of avoiding a revolution is something that comes up both from those who are in power and those who want power. So in that sense, it's a necessity to discuss reform. But the problem is, of course, who can be a reformist and to what extent can it still be used as a political vehicle for mobilization? Who will be bothered to go and vote if you come and say, I have a reformist platform? What do you want to reform? How can you do that? How can you get away with it? And why should I vote for you? Those are questions that are increasingly difficult to answer within the kind of set character list of this repetitive drama every 4 years. So yes, we want change. We don't necessarily want violent change, but how are you going to affect change? And what it is that you want to change? And those are questions that the usual cast of suspects in Iran, as Azadeh mentioned, the reformists, have increasing difficulty to answer. And I think partly it's also a generational difference. That is, most of these reformists are by now veterans one way or another, if not the revolution, then at least the 1980s and early 1990s. What do they have to say to someone who is 25 years old and have heard this story again and again without necessarily seeing much result? And the final point, of course, is that if you want the pressure from below to get anywhere, that pressure also means that the social movement, if there was to be a social movement for this kind of pressure, it needs to be channeled in ways that connect to this economic discontent, but also the political discontent. The problem for the reformists have been that they're good at speaking about liberalization of, cultural mores and whatnot, but they are very bad, in my opinion, at offering something very, very basic that you need before all of that, which is food on the table. And that has become increasingly an actual issue in Iran because of the vastly increased poverty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rusba, for your remarks. So yes, as you mentioned, the decline of trust in the establishment in general, which directly or indirectly affects the people's loyalty and their hope for future changes, whether it's to be in the conservative element or by the reformist elements, is one of the major challenges ahead. And as long as those grievances are not addressed, and as long as the economic environment is not changed, it will be possibly a very challenging environment for the next president to deal with. Before we move on to the next speaker, I would like to ask the audience if they have any questions. They're more than welcome to post them on through the Q&A box of the Zoom function that will be picked up throughout our discussion part of this panel. On that note, we're just going to move to our next speaker, Professor Valli Nast, who is the Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he previously served as the senior advisor to the United States Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Welcome, Professor Nast, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to ISPI for inviting me to this great panel. I very much am in line with what Azadeh and Rusba said. I would just add that actually one point that Rusba said is interesting to dwell on, namely whether we're still in that format of having every 4 years the same essential drama playing out between reformists or moderates, or whether this was really a pivotal turning point in Iranian politics. And, are we entering a phase that we could call literally the third Islamic Republic? In other words, we're going down the path of a fundamentally different politics in Iran. We're moving towards the succession. Could there be constitutional changes, et cetera? So I think that's something beyond the din of the election results we have to watch. I would add one other point to the excellent analysis of public apathy and why Iranians didn't want to vote. One is that I think there is now significant disappointment on the promise of American engagement with the West. I mean, ultimately, what brought massive crowds for Rouhani every time was the idea that there was a there. In other words, if we engage, if we do things, sanctions could be lifted, we could be part of the world. And what Trump really did to Iran is pretty important. This election is under the shadow of the United States basically betraying Iran's middle class or those voters who supported Rouhani. Why should they come and vote again? Because the last time many of them voted purely for supporting a nuclear crisis, if the United States is not giving any indication that it actually is willing to engage Iran unless there is regime change in Iran. And secondly, I would put even more on on the issue of the failure of the moderates and reformists beyond ideal intellectual things. I think President Rouhani is also breaking records as leading office as probably the most unpopular president under the Islamic Republic. I mean, we don't have official notes on the polling, but some polls in Iran had put his popularity or approval rating at single digits towards the end. It was extremely unpopular, not just because they didn't develop JCPOA, he mismanaged COVID, he mismanaged dust bowls and water shortages when there was a new removal of subsidies for gasoline. He claimed he didn't even know, he was disconnected from his own administration. So there was also actual disappointment in the moderates being able to run the country on a day-to-day basis as essentially the administrators. Now, you know, the larger issue that is hanging here, and perhaps as a complement to previous comments, is what does this mean for JCPOA and international regional issues? I mean, there's a lot of talk, of course, about you know, Iran's turn to the right. We know where Raisi is coming from, etc. But it's important to note that it doesn't close the door to engagement with Europe or the United States on the nuclear deal. I mean, first of all, I think the US decoupled and disconnected the negotiations in Vienna from Iran's presidential election. It ignored the deadline of June 18. It didn't try to cut a deal beforehand, and it engaged in a kind of a process that may very well go into the fall. And I think the Supreme Leader and the conservatives like that because it removed this issue from Iran's politics. So the expectation is that the process would be ongoing, and a deal was not dependent on another moderate getting elected. Now, having said that, I think personalities do matter. I mean, going forward, it depends on who is Iran's national security advisor, who's Iran's foreign minister, who's going to be sitting around the table that are going to make big decisions in Iran. There's nothing in Mr. Raisi's own background that suggests that he has in-depth knowledge of international affairs, and nobody in his circle right now, other than the hardline former national security advisor, Saeed Jalili, that has any kind of an international background. And that's a case for worry. In other words, if you don't have people like Rouhani, Zarif, Araqchi, et cetera, sitting around the table, then the quality of decision-making in Iran could suffer. And then also negotiations matter. I mean, the current Iranian negotiators and American negotiators have negotiated with one another a previous time. They know each other very well. Having to negotiate with a new team coming from Iran, which doesn't have experience with JCPOA, doesn't know the characters in Europe or the US, could actually set back the process. So I'm not so worried about Iran in principle wanting to get a deal under Raisi, but rather whether the mechanics will work under a completely new team in the way in which it has. I would say that because of all the reasons that were mentioned by Azadeh and Rusba, Raisi has a great deal of incentive to get this deal. The conservative consolidation in Iran cannot succeed if you can't put food on people's tables. The transition to a new supreme leader was going to be very unpredictable if Iran is under maximum pressure and is in a constant tension with its neighbors and the United States. So I think now that this engineered election has happened, now that they have their candidate in, now that the hardliners are in control, I think a different logic will apply than when they were sitting in opposition trying to prevent the moderates from consolidating power in Iran on the back of a deal with the United States. And I have to say that if Mr. Hemmati or Mr. Larijani had become president in Iran, they wouldn't have got a single one of their ministers passed through this parliament, let alone a deal with the United States. And in fact, ironically, Raisi has probably more sway with this parliament, more ability to manage them than those people would have. And so I'm not, if there is an actually viable deal in Vienna, I think there is motivation on part of Raisi to embrace its economic benefits, selling of oil, getting revenue, opening the country, bringing food to the table. than just rejecting it out of hand because it's some kind of an outreach with the West. And that's the reason why he's already announced that he's not opposed to the deal, and that he sees lifting of sanctions on Iran as a priority for the Iranian government. And then there is the regional issues, which is also important to note. Iranians themselves, particularly conservative Iranians, they say that his election will actually help. Again, it removes this ambiguity about who's in charge in Iran. I think it's very clear now who's in charge in Iran. It's the people that Saudi Arabia, UAE have always pointed their finger at as being the real source of the problem. So now, it's all out on the front. And secondly, the Saudis have already engaged the Quds force in direct negotiations. So these negotiations in Iraq is managed by the commander of the Quds force, General Ghani. That's not going to be impacted by who's foreign minister or who's president. In other words, the negotiations with Iran's main regional rival is not in the Iranian foreign ministry or Iranian government. It's not in Rouhani and Zarif's hand. It's already in IRGC's hands, and there will be continuity there. And so I think that's not dependent on what Mr. Raisi would do or wouldn't do coming in. And then finally, I would say, and I'm sure my colleagues also got the same impression, if you listen to the presidential debates, Mr. Raisi did not give a great sense of knowledge about international affairs. He was quite out of his depth. He's been a bureaucrat in the judiciary, for better or for worse. That's been his career path. He has come up there. He may know a lot about Iran's laws and have implemented them, but he really doesn't know much about anything else. He's on a fast learning curve, but that learning curve will take 2-3 years before he gets to a place where he would be an actual voice and be comfortable to make decisions. So I think in many ways, actually, decision-making on these international and regional issues has already shifted to the office of the Supreme Leader. And as we see on nuclear negotiations, this is very directly now managed by the office of the Supreme Leader, and it's likely to be the case going forward. And so I don't see the election now having an immediate impact on that. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Fascinating points, and we have a lot of questions coming up. So I'm just going to jump into the questions from the audience first before if there was time, I will use my privileged position also to ask some questions. Let's go to the first speaker first. You mentioned the rift within the establishment itself, and the president always falling apart, falling out of favor with other elements, and also Valli mentioned the difficulties of creating consensus between Majlis and the president and the office of Supreme Leader. With Raisi being in this position, Azadeh, do you think consensus building is going to be easier? And if yes, or if no, what are the consequences of that?
I mean, it very much depends on what area we are talking about. Obviously, when you are dominating the three branches of power, consensus building among these three branches is certainly easier. And the hardliners are now dominating parliament, executive, and the judiciary. It's not so easy when it comes to consolidating power across the board, when we're talking about things that go way beyond the executive. That is the question of succession. And here I still believe, as I indicated, there are still other competitors in the race. There are still other groups in the race. Just look at different families who still want to have a say, whether it's the Laurijanis, it's not just the former Speaker of the Parliament, but also his brother Sadr Laurijani, whether it's Ahmadinejad and his camp, whether it's a new generation of self-proclaimed revolutionaries who have a more critical stance also with regard to the current establishment. Some of them, forming in parliament already in form of the justice seekers and others. Or if you look at the Stability Front or so-called Endurance Front, which are probably one of the most radical factions or groups in that regard, you will see that there's still some dynamics going on, that there's still some movement, that you have different kind of groups and actors who would want to capitalize on a weak presidency. And I think, as Rusba said, and this is going to be important, Raisi has a long way to go when it comes to consolidating the economy. I think, obviously, as he has said, anti-corruption campaigns are going to be probably high up on his agenda. He will benefit from suspending sanctions in the short run, at least to a certain extent. That will be of benefit to him. So in the end, again, as I said, a lot will also depend on how long he would have to remain on this post of the presidency. So to sum up, yes, consensus building in some areas might be easier, but this doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be easy to have across the board backing for something that is so much more significant than the presidency, that goes far beyond 4 to 8 years of the executive and is potentially about calling the shots in this republic for decades to come.
Thank you very much, Azadeh. I have now one question for Rusba, but I also wanted to say that to all the three speakers. If there was a point about one of the questions that was not directly addressed to you and you wanted to raise that, please feel free to address that point first and then move on to the question that is specifically addressed to you. Rusba, you have a question about economic issues. You mentioned nepotism, corruption as correctly as the root causes of this economic hardship and the source of discontent amongst the people. Do you think the next president will be able to address those? If yes, how? This is a $1 million question. And yeah, I will just leave the second point to you to raise later. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I mean, let me just chime in a bit on the question that you asked, Azadeh. I would actually be even more pessimistic in the sense that for me, the conservative camp in Iran reminds me a lot of the Republicans in the US. They're great at being against stuff. They're very bad at being for something. And you see that once they are in power, because when they are in power, they fall apart. I mean, the fact that these people couldn't even come to one single presidential candidate in election after election shows that there are lots of egos and lots of different undercurrents here. So the idea that they have consolidated all the branches of government is more true if you believe that the label means that much. But to say that the hardliners have consolidated the branches of government doesn't actually mean anything once you get down to the nitty-gritty of what kind of legislation are they going to support, all of them, what kind of policies do they want to pursue. And that's where you see the differences between them, whether they are on a personal level or on a kind of more principle level, means that they're not usually as unified as people would like to think, whether it's for good or bad. So I'm, in that sense, not impressed by the idea that they would somehow now be quickly able to get a lot of legislation through that means anything to anyone. That remains to be seen as far as I'm concerned. Again, they're much better at bashing the reformists than they are at actually pursuing anything that looks like proper policy. And that, in a sense, is the segue to your second question. The problem here is that we can talk about two kinds of corruption. You have the everyday corruption that anyone can kind of, who is in a position of power, no matter how minuscule it is, can indulge in, right? So if I dole out permits, I can make sure I get a bit of extra cash when I give you the permit. But that, and that in a sense can be widespread. But the other one, which is the one that the government really has to deal with, is institutionalized corruption. And the problem, of course, with institutionalized corruption in a system where the state is so strong, both in the economic field, but also politically so dominant, is of course that the roots and tentacles of that corruption goes very deep into the state itself. So basically, you're trying to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which is often very difficult, if not impossible. So if Raisi really wants to do something about corruption, it means that he's going to not only trample, but actually quash a number of toes that belong to people that are equally or more powerful than he is himself. So he needs to then deftly play chess in various dimensions with different groups to be able to get away with that. And so there again, the question is, well, what is his conservative label good for? Because being conservative will not guarantee that everyone will support his anti-corruption drive, because some of that anti-corruption drive is going to hit other conservatives. So in that sense, he can do things. He can make certain things more transparent, especially when it comes to tenders and things like that. But Those more institutional things are going to be very difficult. He will need to do something about the lack of transparency in the banking system. He will need at some point to cut down to size the IRGC's various business branches and construction companies and so on. And the question is he willing and secondly able to take on those kind of institutionalized forms of corruption?
Thank you very much, Rusba. I'll come back to you with another question shortly. Now, moving on to you, Valli. We have a couple of questions about the deal and the future of the deal. One is concerned with whether or not the engineering, so-called, of the election by, the voting and only letting very weak candidates to run along Raisi was prompted domestically in order to achieve a better deal with the West or not. And the second question is starts with the assumption that you are quite optimistic. I didn't really get that sense of optimism from your remarks. Are you really optimistic that Raisi is going to be able to carry out the negotiations to get a good deal if the deal is not done and dusted before he's sworn in August? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, just reflecting one sentence on the excellent analysis Rusba did. The two-ton elephant that was not that's been sitting in the middle of the room with corruption and the economy and wasn't mentioned even during the presidential debates directly is really the Revolutionary Guards and the extent of the Iranian economy that it controls. And it's definitely one of those white elephants that Raisi will be very hard pressed to challenge. I'm generally optimistic because I think both Iran and the United States need the deal. And I don't think that the deal in the short run really rests on Raisi. We have a tendency in the West, and when there is a reformist Iranian president, everybody dismisses them as being irrelevant. It's all the supreme leader. And then when we get a hardliner president like Ahmadinejad and Raisi, everybody immediately assumes as if the president in Iran is going to be making all the decisions. I think the process that Iran has embarked in on Vienna Accords predates Raisi. It's fairly advanced. There are some key political decisions that Iran and the United States have to make for the deal to be sorted out. And those are really above the pay grade of an Iranian president. And I think it ultimately comes down to the supreme leader, regardless of who was there. And these could come even before Raisi is in office. So then Raisi's impact on whether JCPOA is restored or not is limited. Then it comes to implementation. And again, the implementation part is not up to the Iranian president. It's up to the nuclear agency. And again, it comes under Iran's national security apparatus. And the issue of if Iran is going to agree to a follow-on deal, again, it has to be a system-level decision. So Raisi could increasingly, as we go forward and as he gets confident and he learns on the job, become a bigger voice on the national security debates. But in the short run, I don't think that's the case. And let's not forget, he probably is the Iranian president that has been most clearly appointed to his position by the supreme leader, is the one that has the greatest amount of legitimacy deficit and will need the supreme leader in the short run to support him. And so I don't see him being independent of the supreme leader and negating where the supreme leader wants to go on the nuclear talks. And during the presidential campaign, he stayed fairly close to the supreme leader. If the supreme leader accepts JCPOA, he accepts JCPOA. If he accepts Vienna, he will accept Vienna. So, but on the other hand, I think he has some advantages in making the deal to stick. In other words, moderates or Rouhani or Hemmati, et cetera, would have been far more hard-pressed dealing with conservative opposition to a deal than Raisi would be. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to get in line, but ultimately he's one of them, and that gives them certain advantage. I do think that the supreme leader and Raisi will have a very hard time managing Iran, as both Azadeh and Rusba said, if the economic situation remains the same. Yes, they could be comfortable for the next 6 months, 8 months, year, but beyond that, the economic forecast for Iran under the current conditions, without putting some economic impetus into society is very bleak, and that doesn't serve them well. And all of the issues that Azadeh and Rusba mentioned, namely his lack of legitimacy, the infighting, even with the conservatives, fighting corruption, putting food on people's tables, all of these issues are likely to come apart under a weak president, illegitimate president, unless he can boost the economy. And he can't boost the economy unless he cuts a deal with the US. So I think I don't see him, I think his rhetoric and the rhetoric of the conservatives should be separated from the reality that they're facing. So to that extent, I'm optimistic that pragmatically, if they don't want to implode, they would have to get to a deal.
Thank you. Before I move on to the next questions, I just couldn't help but jumping in to ask my own question. Yes, Supreme Leader would like to micromanage the negotiation. This is not new. This is what he did under the JCPOA. He closely micromanaged every single step of the deal. And he's going to continue doing that. But the deal that what we got last time, we were unlucky that Trump became president and he started that maximum pressure campaign. And also there were some technical challenges within the deal. Like, for example, the dollar transactions were not resolved. The sanctions for human rights issues, for missile program, for regional activities, they all remained in place. Are we likely this time around to see a deal that allows more sanction relief than the previous time? Or are we expecting a more limited scope of sanction relief in comparison with the JCPOA?
My sense is that what is on the table before Iran is less for more. It's not compliance for compliance like Iran wanted. You know, there's some sanctions that Iran got lifted first time are not going to be lifted again. And yet the United States is pushing Iran to sign on to follow on negotiations, etc. And for that reason, I think if Iran is going to cut a deal, it is a political decision. It's not a technical decision. And that political decision to accept less for more has to come from above Raisi's pay grade. So I think all the technical issues have already pretty much been resolved. It's really now at the level of whether Iran would accept a less for more final deal.
Thank you. And if that's the case, the impact that this deal will have on the economic environment in Iran will be limited, and therefore Raisi's success for resolving the economic hardship is going to be affected by that, and we're going to remain in this vicious cycle. So before I get too obsessed about economic issues, I have two last questions, and I want Azadeh or Rusba choose and pick whichever you want. One is about the role of civil society and how are we likely to see civil society contributing towards having more demand from the establishment or changes and reform in Iran. And the second one is about the question of human rights. We have a question about specifically about minorities. What would be the situation of the minorities, religious minorities under Raisi? But I would like to expand that and get your take on, generally speaking, human rights. What do we expect under Raisi? So I will give the floor to ladies first. Azadeh, you go ahead first. You choose whichever you want. And Rusba, you're going to be left with the second question, I'm afraid.
Well, maybe just broadly and what to expect. I think we're in a very interesting position, actually. We're in a position where a majority of the electorate decided that voting is no longer an effective channel for any sort of change. At the same time, it seems that particularly in the middle class, there isn't really appetite for, let's say, violent overthrow of the existing system. There's some concern and worries about Iran turning into the next Syria, Iran turning into the next Libya. So this is not necessarily a point in time where we see maybe a mass consensus of having yet another revolution or yet another, let's say, violent overthrow here. And if that's the case, the question is what is actually left in between that would be feasible, that would, point to a way moving forward. And I think here what I would actually expect is a number of different things here. First of all, I think it's important to remind ourselves that this is still just one moment in time. Things might look differently in 4 years from now. If we still have presidential elections in 4 years, people might come to a different conclusion as they did in the past when they went through 4 years of a hardline presidency. And people might once again participate in elections. But At the same time, what we see is, again, and we talked about it, the need for the reformists as a faction to renew themselves and to offer something new. In many ways, they would have to lend a new hand, have kind of a new social contract, if you will, with the population. So you would need to have some kind of really fundamental change taking place in the factional sphere. But a part of that, I think what we will see is what we saw in the past before. I mean, we still, for decades, had a strong civil society in Iran. We have different kind of movements and so-called non-movements. We have women fighting for their own rights, trying to push back on the hijab quite successfully. And if you look at the history of the hijab in Iran, we have environmentalists still pushing on the fronts, trying to raise awareness and do their work. We have teacher strikes. We have a number of different groups of people who are still active on a civil society front and who are trying to use different kind of creative channels to move forward. Now, how will a Raisi government deal with them? I think it's probably not that certain to say. I mean, there's different things here. One, I think a lot of people would expect way more brutal crackdowns, and this might likely be the case once we see more protests, once we see more, let's say, violent outbursts here. But at the same time, there might be some dynamics in place at some point where Raisi would be inclined to look for some further spaces in some areas of the society in order to garner a little bit more broader public support with regard to his own ambitions of becoming the supreme leader. This might be wrong. Maybe he has entirely given up on that, but I think it would be something to consider, that there are some spaces that he might be willing to open up, and he might be in a better position to do so, specifically because he is lacking legitimacy quite widely at this point. So overall, I expect civil society to remain vital, but under pressure. They have to face the same kind of systemic obstacles that they have faced in the past decades. They probably likely will face ongoing violence in case of larger challenges and protests, but I think they will continue. So this is not exactly the end, as I said, of public civil action in Iran. Voter apathy is not the same as having an apathy when it comes to political action. And so I expect a lot of more vitality and more drive to come from the space of the social realm.
Thank you. Rusba, to you now.
Thank you. If I may, I just want to have a rejoinder to what Valli said. I mean, I agree, but I think maybe I don't have your insights into what's happening in Vienna, but I would like to point out that to some degree, there has always been a part of the system that thinks that just muddling through economically is good enough, if it means you don't have to budge on other things. So in that sense, I am, if you will, more optimistic or pessimistic, depending on from which angle you look at it, that they will not give more to the US without getting what they want. The problem for the Iranians, of course, is that even if the United States gives up on the sanctions that have been added in contravention of the JCPOA, there are other kinds of sanctions the US has added during Trump, which are under terrorism label and other labels that are not part of the JCPOA. So in a sense, the US can get legally to eat its cake and still keep it. And that is, of course, both a practical problem, but also politically a problem if you come back to Tehran with a deal and you have it signed, but the US will still sanction you on some things because they have put it just under a different label. So that's a tricky thread to kind of get through the needle. Now, to your questions, Sarah, I mean, I think Azadeh is right. I mean, we have to make a distinction between people's willingness to engage in politics as a political activity and politics as an electoral activity. I mean, remember that after the brutal crackdown on students in 1999, everyone said, the student movements are finished, they're never going to engage in politics again. Then came 2009, and in a sense, a new generation, the next generation of students and others engaged. Now, that doesn't mean that they're willing to bang their heads bloody against this wall of the Nizam every 10 years. I'm not saying that, but I think there is, it's important to remember that unless you find another alternative, a totally systemically different alternative, at some point you're going to try and get some change, no matter how small it is, from within the confines that you're allowed to. The problem, in a sense, is that this system, or especially its repressive parts, tends to interpret everything as a threat to the state. I mean, the fact that you have bus drivers striking is not a systemic threat, unless you make it into a systemic threat by basically claiming that it's a security issue rather than a labor issue. And so in a sense, they're kind of, they're making things worse for themselves. And the question now is if Raisi and the system, being all conservative, so to speak, whether they feel more secure in the seat of power and would therefore be more lenient towards these kind of protests, or whether they would rather feel much more intolerant because they don't have to tolerate it, or that's at least their interpretation. So I think in that sense, it can go in both ways. But nonetheless, civil society, no matter what pressure it has been under, has always tried to survive, because the issues that they're trying to address and they're trying to organize around are issues that are part of their everyday lives. So it's not something you can just put on a shelf and come back to 10 years later.
Thank you very much to all of you. We have about 10 minutes. I would like to give each and every one of you another 3 minutes for your closing remarks. If you have any points in relation to the previous questions or anything else that you would like to add. But the final question that I have on my list is linking the role of IRGC with the future of Iran. And I think we probably didn't really talk about IRGC enough. I'm glad that Valli mentioned the direct involvement of IRGC now in the negotiations with the GCC, specifically with Saudi Arabia, that is taking place in Iraq. And with that in mind, I'd like you, each and every one of you, if you have a point or two to make on the future role of IRGC. Are we likely to see a stronger position than before? Are we not? Are we likely to see a complete takeover, which is the actual question here? So the floor is yours. We're going to go this time in reverse order. Valli, we start with you, and then to Rusba, and then to Azadeh. Thank you.
I mean, I guess the leitmotif of our conversation that there's a lot of unpredictability in Iran, and there are many fissures and there are many tensions, so nothing's really a given. But I mean, if you looked at the history of many other countries, Pakistan, Indonesia, Egypt, Myanmar, when militaries under the guise of national security become dominant institutions, then they get their fangs into the economy, when they become kingmakers in the political arena, it's not easy to get them out. They may change direction in terms of their foreign policy orientation, etc., but they don't easily leave. I'm pessimistic about this. I think we've passed the point of no return, with the IRGC becoming too involved in Iran's economy and too important in foreign policy decision-making, as Foreign Minister Zarif mentioned it in his tape, for it to now be put back in the box. And I think the trends in Iran are likely to strengthen it. In other words, every bus strike, as Rusba said, is argument for why they need more power, they need to control more things. And so I think, in a post-Khamenei era, depending on who the supreme leader is, they may not need to take over directly, but they're likely to continue to play an extremely dominant role.
Thank you. Rusba.
Well, let me, just for the sake of argument, disagree slightly with Valli here. I mean, I think he's right on the historical trend when you look at other countries. But my counter argument would be that if you look at the Iranian military in the last century, no matter how much money people have poured into it, they have, in a sense, always been subservient to the political centers of power. Now, you could argue that the IRGC is not like the old Artesh of the Shah, even though they were even more, so to speak, cuddled by him. But I would still argue that the difference then is that the IRGC is also much more varied in its forms. I mean, the IRGC is not a monolithical institution. It's more like a Venn diagram within a larger Venn diagram, which is the political elite. So there are parts of the IRGC that are very much business oriented, and there are other parts who really love being in uniform. And they all belong to the IRGC, but really how much of a unified entity are they when it comes to those kind of existential political decisions, which is, shall we become a Praetorian Guard, or shall we stand back and just guard, so to speak? So in that sense, I would still argue that it's not perhaps a question of putting them back in the box. I don't believe in that's going to happen. But the question is, being out of the box, what does it mean? So maybe there is still a sliver of hope that it's not at least a total takeover. It's not a Pakistani military trajectory that we're looking at, not as long as those other political centers are still as strong as they are. I mean, just look at the way everyone reacted, not just the IRGC, but everyone around them, when two candidates coming directly, more or less, from uniform wanted to become presidential candidates. It was a kind of a more or less total rejection of that idea, you know, going back to quoting Khomeini, et cetera, about not getting involved in politics.
Just to add to that, I mean, if we look back a couple of months, I think there was a lot of talk about militarization in Iran or further militarization, that the IRGC would be taking over the executive. And we actually saw a very big number of former IRGC commanders trying to run for the presidency. In the end, if you look at the selection by the Guardian Council, we had one former commander being allowed to run. That was it. That was Mohsen Rezai, who didn't make it in the end when it came to the elections. And I think this goes into the direction that what we heard from Rusba in that regard, and also from Valli, that we might in some areas be overestimating the kind of influence and then the kind of ambition trajectory that the IRGC has, and in other areas probably underestimating it. But I think that when it comes to IRGC, I fully agree with Rusba. It is difficult to talk about it as one solid institution. You have different groups, whether it's the intelligence organization, whether it's the Quds brigades, who are responsible for regional activities, whether it's within these kind of groups where you have those factionally leaning towards the reformists, factionally leaning towards hardliners. You do have the kind of dynamics and complexities that are in the system also represented within the IRGC itself. So these elections, I think, actually showed that they haven't taken over. Raisi is not really the IRGC candidate. He has close ties to parts of the IRGC, but he's not the traditional IRGC candidate. This is not to say that the IRGC could not have more impact and more influence in the years to come. But at this point, at least, I think some of those worst case nightmare scenarios that were built even just a couple of months ago haven't really materialized. And maybe that's partly due because of some of those internal constraints that Rusba has been laying out.
Thank you very much, everyone. It was a great honor to be tonight with you and to chair this session. I think my take from this discussion, this excellent discussion, was that under the Rouhani administration, we talked a lot about uncertainties, economic uncertainties, political uncertainties, foreign policy uncertainties. And under Raisi, we ended up talking a lot about uncertainties about those uncertainties. So I would leave you with that note that there are a lot of questions. There's to be a lot of these sessions to be held, and a lot of discussions and a lot of questions to be answered. Thank you very much for being here tonight. It was a pleasure to see you all, and stay safe, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.